Thank you very much for being here today. It's interesting to note, I think when you look at it, growers only have 40 chances to grow a crop in their lifetime. And it's very realistic, it's very interesting, and it's very challenging to think that they have one time to make it right each year and to really set the stage, to really set the opportunity, not only for their legacy, but also legacy for their children. And we look at it, I think everything we talked here today, with Dr. Bilo and with what Dean was saying, I mean, it sets the stage. It's not just one piece of the puzzle that's that silver bullet. It's a lot of different factors that's put together that really sets that opportunity. And I think when we look at it, being an avid sports fan, I kind of look at and imagine that to football. When you look at some of the football teams, who's going to make it to the Super Bowl? What teams usually get there? And it's normally not the one for me, growing up in Indiana, and I love the picture of Peyton Manning. Wish he had the Colts uniform on though still. But you look back at the Colts and the years that they had probably the best offense ever. They only made it to that pinnacle one time, and they only won once. And that was the only year that they actually had all the pieces of that puzzle right, where they had the defense, they had the special teams. And I think that's when we start to look at it, same way with the corn production. It's not one piece. There's no silver bullet. But when we start to look at everything from top to bottom, from starting at that early segmentation as far as crop emergence, all the way to the reproductive stage, that's when we start to see how that opportunity lies. And that's where we start to see those growers that are passionate and producing the most they can on each acre. So looking here today, I'm really going to go through more of a market review, kind of where that crop establishment phase is. And then talk more about diving into what we have to offer with BASF. On the corn side, I want to talk a little bit today about Xanthion and how that has impacted growers. We started just the past couple of years ago as more of a fad that we really stumbled upon with not only our business reps, but also with channel partners like West Central, looking at what else we can put into that In-Furrow that gave us that increase, gave us that stand establishment. And then we'll talk about Preaxor a little bit. Why are we looking at Preaxor and soybeans compared to Xanthion? Why don't we keep it just the same? So we'll leave it to that, and then hopefully have some questions, towards the end to kind of close it out. When we start talking about it, we've heard this earlier today. What is the opportunity of that corn plant? Randy Dowdy, had 504 bushels just 2 years ago. Unbelievable. But I think the opportunity lies within the American farmer today. Do we just get half of that? Do we get close to that mark and that plateau? Those are the challenges that we face. And looking at segments that we have, especially here in In-Furrow, it all starts with the seed. And I used Dr. Bilo's presentations for many years in Central Illinois. It is about keeping that plant and never having a bad day. So when we start to talk about, what has happened in production agriculture. Dean mentioned earlier last night, for some of you that was here last night earlier, what has happened to the growers today? On average, these growers are getting larger. We're seeing fewer growers. Dean commented there's a higher number of 2,000 acre growers out there. That number, as far as a compound annual growth, every year, those growers are growing 8% more than any other grower that's out there. So they're facing challenges. They're facing challenges going over more acres, going over a large geography, and how do they get the corn planted in a timely manner. Also on top of that, when you start to talk about what's happened as far as planting practices, in the past 10 years, planting has increased anywhere from 7 to 10 days across the board. And we start to look at that, and one of the other pieces I'll talk about here is growers are looking at what's that maximum opportunity. And we kind of talk about that bell curve as far as production is concerned. When is that cutoff where you start to see that production decline? And we start to talk about planting dates. Typically, we start to look at up here in Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota. That first part of mid-May or first part of May, you start to see anywhere from maybe 1/3 to 1% of that crop decline every day that you're pushed past that optimum planting date. And I think, we start to also take a look at what challenges we face with Mother Nature. Myself back in Illinois just past 2 years ago, we start to look at a 3-week window that we had opportunity-wise for planting. Mother Nature challenged us. Even though we had 3 weeks on that calendar, no matter where you were in Illinois, you might have only had 18 to maybe 4 suitable days planting. Growers are faced with these challenges to get that crop in earlier and get it established at a timely rate. So we started talking about the yield maximization curve, and Dr. Beal kind of like this. He can probably say exactly who it's from, with Dr. Nafziger. Illinois as well as Iowa State has looked at this curve quite a bit, looking at where that crop is in that stage as far as planting and how it is affected on the actual bushels that they produce. He did this study over 7 years and really found that that 3rd week in April is the optimum planting date where you see the maximum production. So when we start to look at that curve, when we start talking about Liebig's Law and start to look at the in-furrow segment, what are those challenges that each grower is faced with in in-furrow? We talked about the cultural practices. We talked about planting dates. But I think one of the biggest factors that we have is fertility, which has been a big topic here today. And then I want to talk a little bit, go beyond that a little bit more, talking about that disease pressure, talking about that plant health effects. And those are some of the things that's been very big and very passionate, with myself here with BASF. So overall, I think one of the biggest when I started with BASF was we're all inundated as far as what works as far as a fungicide. And I have to say and contend to say that we're starting where most people think, we've kind of leveled out, we've kind of plateaued as far as fungicide applications are concerned. I think we're just starting. Where I was in Central Illinois, we were kind of adapted and told, that tassel market, that's our number one piece, and we always have to go after it. We've actually just started. We're looking at places like this as far as the in-furrow market. That's just scratching the surface. There's other pieces that we're really just scratching the surface. And it's all about sitting down with that grower. What matters? Because when we start to look at a tassel market as number one piece on the grower's mind in Illinois, we come up to this part of the world in Minnesota, South Dakota. We're looking at those factors as far as getting that crop out of the ground. We're going in colder, wetter soils. And that's our number one piece that we have to overcome. So overall, and this really goes to the fact, Dr. Beal talked a little bit earlier. What about that stance? What happens if a plant comes up a little bit later? If we can get all the plants up, that is great. But what happens if that plant comes up and emerges 5-10 days later? One of the neat things we did with a couple of our cooperators at Seymour was do a cut plant study. And we looking at possibly pushing that crop back, maybe 5 days, 10 days. But what we did was every 6 plant, we cut it back a half leaf, 1 leaf, and a leaf and a half. What happens to that crop? On average, those plants that were cut back at a half a leaf, we saw anywhere from, on average, about 10 bushel difference. That's a huge factor when you start to look at overall, over that whole study, we saw anywhere from $42 to $63 of lost revenue. All those plants came up, we just set it back. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, it's a weed when we start to talk about that competition. So what is xanthan for a fungicide? Last couple of years we started with Headline, been the leader in the market. And we had the opportunity with the acquisition of Becker Underwood a couple of years ago, was really to open up the pipeline of biofungicides. What does that matter? Headline we've seen as far as being the leader in the marketplace, as far as offering us opportunities, giving us not only disease protection, but also the plant health effects, giving us that increased efficiency and really working against stressful conditions. But what the addition of the biofungicide with Integral brought us was really the only EPA registered product today. And it acts totally different as we get to talk about the In-Furrow, where I'm going to show you what we see, not only that root zone protection that we're going into, but we're also talking about root protection and really creating a shield. And that's what a biological does when we start to take and look at it a little bit deeper. And then we're going to talk about longer seeding protection. Overall, what you see as far as on seed treatments today, whether it's a corn seedling or whether it's a soybean seedling, normally gives you about 10 to 14 days protection, in that beginning life cycle of that plant. How do we take that and increase that 3, maybe 4 times longer? Protect that plant through its overall life cycle. Overall, when we start to talk about it, I think we see a lot of unique benefits. Not only as we talk about showing a bunch of Phytophthora as well as Rhizoctonia protection, but we also see Pythium. And this was really looking at a little bit just on Rhizoctonia inoculated plots in the greenhouse. What do we see? We're going to see emergence come up very similar to plants that have no inoculation involved. We're going to see equal to an emergence. A couple of field shots when we start to look at, looking at Xanthion in the field earlier this year, was giving us that overall quicker emergence and overall, seedling, as far as overall plant. When we start to talk about plant health, I think it's very impactful. What does headline do? When we start to talk about that component, we're really starting to really dive into, we see greater root length and we see greater root mass. Overall, compared to untreated, as far as looking into labs, we see root length being on average 17% greater than an untreated plant. And when we start talking about the root surface, as far as having that root surface area to bring up those nutrients and really spoon feed that plant, we see on average about 10% greater root surface area on being able to absorb and take up those nutrients. When we start to look at, I think one of the biggest pieces with the Xanthion is that of the integral or the biofungicide. And what happens, as we can kind of see, we've inoculated in the center part of each one of the Petri dishes, Pythium, Rhizoctonia, and Fusarium. And on the outside, we actually put the integral piece. And we get excellent control, from the integral, more so than any other biofungicide that's on the market today. What happens to the integral is that it does react a lot differently in that furrow compared to headline. And as we go in through here, we'll talk a little bit about the spray solution, but as that solution has gone into the furrow, your headline will be very active and take care of any disease that we have that's actually captured that may be sitting in there. What happens now is the biofungicide is really colonizing with those roots. As those roots start to develop, you'll start to see it colonize and really protect and create a shield, as you can kind of see as far as a greenness, upon that. And as that plant still continues to grow and still continues to thrive, going all the way through possibly as far as the VT growth stage, anything that may come in contact as far as disease is concerned, that's where you're going to start to see that integral. And that's where the parts where we start to talk about biologicals going a little bit further, even beyond that of what we see in the past with headline. Overall, it's all about creating that plant stand, giving us more plants and giving us with those plants that come up quicker in emergence. And a lot of times we'll take stand counts anywhere from 7 to 14 days. And we don't see it as great as a difference. But as you start to see that plant grow and as you start to go in conditions which could cause seedling loss, we get more of a true number when we start to look out about 21 to 30 days as far as those stand counts. And it's interesting with Xanthion compared to headline. We saw anywhere from 500 to 800 more plants with Xanthion than we did with headline. And overall, we're starting to see very similar now that we've got it out for 1 year. We're starting to see that stand count be exactly what we saw early on as far as our trials were concerned. Looking at a little bit more as far as some beauty shots that we've had, from the field. This was some of the pieces that we've taken from South Dakota. Kind of hard to see the pictures between the treated and untreated, but what you can see, we've got greater root growth, we've got greater root mass, and we're starting to see a little bit more above ground, differences. As we look at another one here from Wisconsin, we're starting to see, roughly 55 days after treatment. Root mass may have caught up a little bit on the untreated, but we're starting to see something happen above ground. Some things above ground that could, pose some great opportunities for us. One of the pieces I use quite a bit is this one in Kentucky. We've got a couple of, specialty plots. We've created a different platform within BASF, a Grow Smart platform, looking at growers' practices that they use currently today, and how can we maybe increase those practices with a couple of tweaks. This is one from Kentucky that I think is very, very unique when we start to look at that treated plant compared to the xanthian alone, and then compared to xanthian plus starter fertilizer. And I think the unique thing about it is that we saw, one, root mass took a stair step up. But I think one of the most important pieces is what's happening here. As far as these plants are concerned, this was actually a V5. As far as growth stage, this was actually a V6. This was actually a V7, close to a V8 stage as far as plants were concerned. What does that mean for a grower, not only as far as getting that crop out of the ground quicker, but what's that mean for the grower as far as his overall crop? We talked and we heard a lot earlier today as far as the length of time, in Minnesota, as far as how much actual time length that we have as far as going from planting to harvest. That window is narrowed. What happens, to a grower down south? That you might have a longer growing condition, but we might be able to go through the heat of summer as far as pollination a little bit quicker. So I think there's opportunities by getting that crop out of the ground and established earlier. You've got positives on both sides of the spectrum as far as being in cooler conditions that have shorter climates compared to also those that might go through the heat of the day and pollination a little bit sooner. And now that we're looking at a lot of the data coming in, these are some of the estimates that we're seeing. We're seeing consistent data come across the board as far as xanthian's concerned. Overall, looking at some of the trials that we had just last year and a lot of the research, we saw anywhere from 4 to 5 bushel. This is still about a bushel to a bushel, or 1.3 bushel better than what we had with headline, which has been the standard in the industry. So changing gears a little bit and looking at soybeans. We have the same opportunity. We start to look at how much is a soybean plant actually can produce. And 160 was the record that Kip Collars had just a couple years ago. What if we look at getting half of that amount from what we have as far as a national average on soybean production today? As a tremendous opportunity, it's a tremendous goal that we can strive for. Overall, when we start to talk about soybeans are a little bit more finicky as far as having stand counts and stand losses. And looking at just a 20% loss in stand count could attribute to 4% of that bushel for that grower. And while it may not be as much as corn, you're still looking at anywhere from $25 to $30 an acre as far as a loss on keeping that stand protected. So Preaxor has really been our fit and our goal on soybeans. When we first came out with Headline some 8-9 years ago, that was really our lead across the board. And then we came with Headline Amp on corn. So when we came with Preaxor with the Xemium component just 3 years ago now, we really want to create and have that efficiency and show the power of what Xemium does on soybeans, because there's a lot of interaction as what we see. But it gives us similar components when we start to look at the In-Furrow piece on Preaxor as we did with xanthian on corn. We're still going to see very good control as far as Rhizoctonia, Phytophthora and Pythium, and really give us that plant health or those physiological benefits on being able to create a root mass that's larger and being able to produce a plant and maybe keep it a little bit further ahead as far as the growth stage, which we're going to show. It's unique. This was taken a little bit further south. This was actually around my home area now in North Carolina. But as you can see, compared to the untreated, we see more vigorous root systems. Very similar to what we saw as far as the xanthian. But I think that another unique piece is we're getting that plant up and established quicker. We've actually got we got the first trifoliate actually pushing out, and we've seen this across the board on soybeans. Pushing on a little bit further, this was actually taken in a Kentucky area. We show the same factor as far as showing there more root mass, showing more above ground foliage, being able to keep that plant more protected and take it in and take it as far as maximizing bushels. Overall, we see the similar piece as far as root mass and root area. What we see as far as the greenhouse piece is showing up to 10% more root mass that we have compared to an untreated plant. And overall, we don't have as much data on soybeans. We're still just scratching the surface. We see a very positive piece when we start to look at the untreated check. Anywhere from 3 to 5 bushels as far as what we've seen on soybeans. And I think one of the pieces that I kind of look at is really kind of one of my fun facts to really kind of end as far as talking about the In-Furrow piece. And as Dean alluded to, I made sure my numbers are right. I think we're right on. But overall, the In-Furrow market is 20% of the actual corn market today. And I think it was interesting to note one of the surveys that we kind of put out this past year as far as some of the studies that we did. We went out and polled a lot of growers, those that were already using In-Furrow and those that hadn't looked at it just quite yet. And it was quite amazing that almost half of those growers that weren't using In-Furrow stated that within the next 3 years, they were likely to take a look at it. But I think there was one thing that was glaringly different and stood out amongst the study that we put out there. And a lot of them were wanting to be informed, wanting to know more information. They were concerned that the cost factors weren't there. And I think that was one of the big pieces, just being here today with all of you, talking about that with the lift component. How do we get that word out to show what we're seeing as far as what happens with In-Furrow? How do we get that corn plant started out and never having a bad day and get it off to the best start that it possibly could? So that's the biggest piece I think today for us is how do we become more informed and how do we take that word out a little bit further? One of the other pieces that we had was overcoming hurdles and barriers. And with us, with myself coming into the office, we started talking about how do we help that grower overcome that cost factor. And I know there's some things that the folks from West Central are working on also, but it's one of the things we talked about was how do we take that hurdle and overcome it? And we kind of put out there that first initial cost factor as far as starting from scratch is a huge burden. A burden that could cost anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000, depending on the planter's size and setup. And it's one of the things that we talked about was how do we alleviate that as much as we can. So we really put a program out to work with the folks at West Central and others on basically giving that grower $1 an acre back, for the use of Xanthion, and really kind of help them to not totally eliminate, but get it to a working realization that they really start to look at what matters to them is what the In-Furrow process does and how that takes them to the next level in production. So overall, in summary, I think, as we talked about, with growers, they have only 40 chances as far as crop production is concerned. And we start to look at, they want to put that crop in the best possible position to win. And really taking and eliminating some of those chances, especially as those growers are getting larger and larger, they're going in conditions that's tougher, going in cooler, wetter conditions. And being able to look at some factors like an In-Furrow application where you start to look at not only the fungicide and fertilizer, but also disease protection. Those are some of the key pieces that takes those growers to the next level and really gets them to the opportunity to set their legacy as far as production is concerned. With that, I think, we have any questions?
Questions for Stout?
Yes.
Like you, I hear a lot of questions about cost. What is the In-Furrow cost for a producer per acre of furrow?
As far as the total system or just the fungicide piece that? Whole system, it depends. If you're looking at the fertilizer, the fungicide, and insecticide, you're probably in that $25 range. Yeah, $25 to $30 range. Yes.
And are you looking at In-Furrow in conjunction with seed treatments too, or instead of seed treatments? Or?
I believe it's in conjunction because when we start to look at, the seed treatments are on there in that first part of that seedling's life. And what we're really looking at as far as the fungicide component is to take it that much further beyond. You know, overall, you know, like I said, you got yet 10 to 14 days that you see on the seed treatment. How do we take that, you know, into the plant's B3 stage? You know, going out there 3 to maybe 4 times longer, and that's what we've seen as far as our test is concerned.
Any special handling with these kind of products? Are they different than your traditional?
No, the only special piece with Xanthion is it is a co-pack, and there are some mixing challenges. So one of the pieces, and I brought some handouts that we can show. One of the pieces is we've worked with a company in South Dakota, CNR Ag, and developed a dosatron system that really keeps it in suspension and keeps those products working with the fertilizer very good, so it gets in the furrow and does what we can. Those are the only pieces that we're looking at today. I mean, down the road, I think we're looking to how do we put those two products that's all in one that we can throw it in the tank. But one of the things that when we came out with Xanthion, it was one of the fastest products to market that BASF probably ever has. It went from concept to actual registration and on the ground within 6 months. So.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yes.
Back to the biofungicide, how does that actually work when you talk about a barrier? What are the specifics of that?
Well, the one thing about the biofungicide that we've seen is that it colonizes on the roots. So as those roots start to grow, as we're starting to look through and go through the pictures, the biofungicide piece will actually colonize and grow on the roots because it is a living organism. So, and that's where it creates that shield on that roots. And as those roots continue to grow and develop, you get that biofungicide to protect that root all the way through. And you know what we've seen has been through V3 or roughly 35 to 40 some days.
So back to the handling question then, is that vulnerable to being a living organism?
No, it's more just between the two, and the reason why it's a co-pack today, it's more the compatibility between the two products. And it's one that we wanted to get to the market quickly just because we saw the results. We are working today internally on how do we get that to be one cohesive product. It can happen, but it's more of a formulation issue.
So it does have certain temperature?
No, I mean, if you had it mixed with water, in say for a grower, typically in water you start to see it degrade a little bit, but as long as it's within certain product mixtures, we're fine. And we look to see probably in the next 2 to 3 years, probably go to a one formulation of Xanthion instead of the co-pack.
Okay, let's give Scott a round of applause.